Hey, you ever go to the funeral of somebody who wasn't very well liked? That's awkward. Far less awkward was the Sega Dreamcast funeral. People were genuinely sad about the passing of the Dreamcast, except the PS2, who not only attended the funeral, but planned, coordinated, and sent out the invitations for it. At least it was respectful enough to do the whole wear black thing, though. The Dreamcast gets treated darn near like some sort of war hero by its fans. Sega was in a bad position financially, and yet they pushed forward with the Dreamcast anyways. Well, at least until they didn't. But I think the reason why so many people have a fondness towards the Dreamcast is because the console and its games just had a certain freshness to them. Colorful, creative, and arcade-influenced foundational emphasis on gameplay, and yet also very progressive at the same time with some forward-thinking games that, at the time, felt a little bit ahead of their time, with the Dreamcast launching just a few years after the PlayStation and N64, despite feeling like it was part of the next generation to follow, a popular topic for fans of arguing. Personally, the Dreamcast is always the console I turn to when I'm looking for games that are jovial, uplifting, and give me a nice boost of positive energy. In fact, quick little story for you. One day I'm not answering my phone, which is somewhat unusual for me. A bit worried, my wife hurries on back home to make sure I'm okay. Am I passed out, dead? No, samba de amigo, baby. Guess who finally got the maracas? Kind of ironic that something considered to be dead, the Dreamcast, could bring somebody so much life. Okay, so for starters, if you're collecting for the Dreamcast, most people will want to start with the console, and luckily, it's pretty straightforward. Just get this one, the one everybody has. Not to sound like a conformist, but there weren't really any revisions made to the Dreamcast, and very few options as far as colors go too. I've always felt this was because Sega was trying to go in a new direction with the Dreamcast, and the color of it was a big part of the branding. A fresh new start heading into the new millennium, not the same old Sega that makes all their consoles in the color black until they made it in black. This is likely the only choice you'll make when buying your console. The standard off-white/gray color? Ooh, that's another good one for arguing. Or the black-colored Sega Sports model. Tends to be a bit pricier, and for some people, with the way they feel about sports games, seeing the word sports on their video game console, well, that's the kind of thing that can get inside a person's head. There are some fancy Japanese exclusive variants as well. Naturally, the rabid crossover Sega Dreamcast and Hello Kitty fan base has been accounted for and taken care of, but in general, the variants of the Dreamcast are for hardcore collectors ready to throw around some heavy dollars. Not those of us who just happen to be in a I like my console in the color blue type of mood. Like I said, most people just get this one. It's iconic, well-liked, and the most affordable of the bunch. You will want to pay attention to the condition though. The lasers are prone to burn out on these consoles, so make sure whichever console you buy is in good working order before you purchase it. When it comes to buying your hardware, where more choices start to come into play is with the controllers you decide to use. The original Sega Dreamcast controller is not something everyone is going to want to form a partnership with. As a result, it has some abandonment issues. Nothing tells you how much people hate a certain controller than the effort made to come up with an alternative. Something that's been able to bond over with the N64 controller and form a real friendship. But for some people, the Dreamcast controller is simply not good enough. Awkward shape, tiny buttons, hard analog stick, and for whatever reason, Sega got rid of their much-loved D-pad. Ah, that beautiful Sega Saturn D-pad. Talk about the one that got away. People do seem to love the VMUs though, but I've always thought of them as more of just a unique little extra than anything else. Most people would be perfectly happy without them, but then again, they can be had for cheap, and so you might as well. That is, so long as you don't mind the blaring beep sound it makes every time you boot up the console when the battery is dead, which any Dreamcast owner will tell you is often. Personally, I got tired of after every time hearing the beep sound go off, thinking a pizza was ready in the oven, only to find out there wasn't. On the flip side, sometimes I think I'm about to play Dreamcast when the oven goes off for pizza, which inspired me to come up with the perfect solution. When I bake a pizza, I also pop a Dreamcast in there so that when the beep goes off, I have a pizza and Dreamcast ready to go. Bada bing, bada boom. Or you could just snip out what's responsible for the squeaking on the inside of the VMU to stop the squealing. The VMU will still hold your save files in addition to performing all its other functions while plugged into a controller, and it doesn't matter if the batteries are dead anymore either. There's a handful of games that do use that squeaking to indicate things in game, but if you're not interested in Skies of Arcadia and Dreamcast, you may not care. That's the main game people tend to bring up. If you really want a VMU to squeak for you, I'd advise to just have two VMUs, one squeaker and one non-squeaker. But in addition to the alternative controllers for the Dreamcast, such as the Striker DC controller, which is a popular choice, there are also various adapters you can get that will allow you to use controllers that you already own and like on your Dreamcast, like the DualShocks and Sega Saturn controller. Unfortunately, the adapter to use a Sega Saturn controller has gotten expensive, an all too common danger in the marketplace. That being said, there are some variations of it, and there's also adapters to use other controllers, including this one here that basically lets you use any controller you can think of, including USB controllers, which includes things like any USB arcade stick, such as this Xbox 360 arcade stick that I like to use. Using an arcade stick on your Dreamcast is a great suggestion because of what an arcade-centric console the Dreamcast is, having so many great arcade games ported to it. Speaking of which, let's talk about the games now. Immediately, when it comes to Dreamcast games, given the high prices of a lot of its games, or, people liking stuff to be free, some will be quick to suggest just burning the games you want onto blank CDRs, since they'll work without any further modification to your Dreamcast. But hold on a second there, because for many collectors, part of the fun is being able to stare at your games. Quick little test for you. Actually not bad, but still not quite as good as the original copies. Now, if you are looking for original copies of games, I do have a suggestion. Imports. And because the Dreamcast has so many arcade games on it that don't require much reading, a lot of the games in its library are very import friendly. Unfortunately, the console itself isn't quite as friendly with import games, as it won't accept games from other regions. Kind of strange that it won't accept officially released games when it will play burned CDRs. Although you can force it to play games from another region, not with brute force, but by having your console modified. I was able to get my console region modded for about $60 at a local shop, and I'd put it right up there among the best things that have ever happened to me. If you have access to a place or person that can modify your console, or if you can find one already modified online, I would suggest it. I should mention that you can also get various swap discs, but that can start to get tiresome, and I'd suggest modding your console over that method if the option is available to you. You could just buy a Japanese Dreamcast too. In any case, many Japanese versions of games cost only a fraction of the price of their US counterparts, and in some cases, I'd say their cover art looks cooler too. Alright, now maybe you're somebody who's not sure if the Dreamcast's game library is even for you in the first place, or perhaps you're just curious which games or what type of games the console has a good reputation for. Fighting games are definitely a big one, with a great combination of both 3D and 2D fighting games. There's some especially unique stuff from Capcom too. Project Justice in particular is a fan favorite with a lot of fun, wacky stuff going on. In fact, fans of Capcom tend to love the Dreamcast because they supported the heck out of it, both as a developer and a publisher. There's also lots of good shoot-'em-ups on the system, as you might expect from a Sega console. Lots of fun racing and driving games on the system too, with Crazy Taxi easily being the highlight for me personally. People describe it as an exaggerated version of driving around San Francisco, but I don't think they've ever actually been to San Francisco. I find it's a pretty accurate depiction of the city from the times I've been there. Then there's the games for the Dreamcast that were made by Sega themselves, and I tend to put these in their own category. I mean, a game like Jet Grind Radio has always felt like a console-defining game to me. There's really nothing like it on any other system. Well, that was just due to circumstance that Sega put their games on other consoles. And on that note, it's certainly worth pointing out that a lot of the Dreamcast's games have since been ported to various other consoles, which makes sense since the Dreamcast's lifespan was so short and many of its games deserve to continue to reach a wider audience. That said, some of the original Dreamcast ports are still considered the best versions of certain games, and there's still a number of deep-cut console exclusives that remain as well. Either way, I think the Dreamcast and some of its marquee games have built a legacy for it that gamers will cherish for some time to come. And while you can collect for it, and people certainly do, it's nice that you don't have to in order to enjoy it. For this video's question, I'd be curious to know what your personal thoughts on collecting for the Dreamcast are. I'd expect answers to be all over the place for this one, which is always interesting for me to read. So feel free to leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's